This story seems incredible, so the writer whom we see in the opening scenes isn't sure if readers will believe its truthfulness. It happened on January 27th, 1985. A grand dinner was arranged in the luxurious mansion to celebrate the 80th birthday of the billionaire Charles Buon. This man had caused quite a stir in his time and had made it into the headlines more often than one can remember. Jean the butler entered the room of the hostess of the celebration. Linda Charles was also present. Linda is Charles's third wife today. She must look magnificent. The entire BUN family had gathered in the mansion. There was Josh, the billionaire's nephew, along with his future ex-wife Magdalene. She drinks a lot and couldn't care less about what her husband thinks about it. Charles asks Linda to go ahead. Charles's goddaughter Melissa and Larry, her husband, were also here, as well as Luke and Kristen, Charles's children. Poet, his sister, is one of those people. One should be wary of. Her spineless husband is called Maurice, and he's a psychiatrist passing by. Linda playfully smiled at him. Charles's Aunt Clara Buon was used to keeping everything under control. What unites all the people in this house is one thing: they hate each other. Charles didn't rush downstairs. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. When it came back on, Charles was lying unconscious near the stairs. Obviously, someone among those present pushed him, but who exactly? Soon, it was all over the news. Charles's condition was undisclosed. The servants gossiped about it. Of course, everyone suspects that the fall wasn't accidental. Linda didn't leave the husband's bedside, who was trying to say something, but his speech was unintelligible. But even when Charles spoke coherently, there was no logic in his words. Charles declared that he wasn't going to die right now. The billionaire suspects every member of his family and the servants in his fall down the stairs. They all have motives, tired of the husband's insults. Linda left his room, as did the nurse Agatha Pewitt. This family is definitely the strangest she's ever had to deal with. The maid Frankie tried to eavesdrop on the conversation between the homeowner and the butler. Charles was telling Jean that he had become a victim of a conspiracy within his own family. The second housekeeper joined Frankie, and at that moment Jean walked out of the room, shaming them. Among the servants, there was a peculiar competition as well. Linda often indulges in flirtation with the butler, hoping that her husband's demise is not far off. After Linda's departure, the servants began to neglect the rules. The nurse often appears here to give Charles the necessary medication. However, Agatha PR had also secretly hoped to draw the homeowner's attention to herself. Charles in turn wants to see her as rarely as possible today. Charles plans to gather all the family members in the house again and asks G to organize everything. Meanwhile, Linda is enjoying life, getting a call from the husband. She was displeased that he interrupted her relaxation. Linda wasn't intending to return, but when Charles offered to double her inheritance, she agreed to attend the family dinner. Charles ordered all the servants except Jean not to show up. The butler, as he should have done, cut the telephone wire. The game begins. Gathered in the house, family members, as before, exchanged insults disguised as pleasantries. They didn't even try to hide their contempt for each other. Charles announced that as soon as the table was set, they would immediately begin discussing business. Soon everyone was seated at the table. Charles began to propose a toast, drawing the attention of the guests, who in turn accused Linda of pushing Charles down the stairs. No one expected her to appear. Linda ironically responded to all the barbs directed at her. Charles wanted to discuss the future of his family, as well as the in-her. Each one at the table hoped to get a decent share. Of course, their greedy intentions were no secret to Charles. Charles despises everyone present, including his son and daughter. His third wife has become his greatest disappointment. Like all his relatives, she is a liar. While Charles was giving a toast, Jean began pouring wine into glasses. The guests became concerned when the head of the family announced that he had not made a decision about the inheritance and did not want to do so at all. Nevertheless, everyone raised their glasses to Charles after drinking the wine. Charles began to feel unwell and stopped showing signs of life. After a minute, the guests panicked, trying to revive Charles. The telephone wire was cut, so they couldn't even call for an ambulance, and only Linda remained calm and even pleased under pressure from the others. Maurice, as a doctor, had to examine Charles, but he fainted. It was obvious that it wasn't a prank, and Charles had actually passed away. Checking his pulse, Josh, his nephew, was finally convinced. Linda continued to sit calmly at the table. At one point, she announced that she had poisoned Charles, but here was someone else pushing him down the stairs. Linda doesn't hide that she poisoned her husband for the inheritance. 50% will go to her, the rest will be distributed among the relatives. It turned out that the day before the dinner, Charles was going to poison one of the family members because he was disappointed in all of them. Charles counted on his wife's help. and offered her half of the inheritance in exchange for her silence. Everything was officially arranged. However, Linda decided to change the rules of the game. Moreover, she poised, and the wine of each of the guests, and within an hour, the poison will take effect. Linda has 8 doses of antidote. There were 9 poison glasses not counting Charles's, so they have to decide within an hour who will live and who will not. The nurse confirmed that such a poison does exist. No one can even call the police because the telephone line is cut. The guests wanted to force Linda to give up the antidote by force, but Jean stood up for the mistress of the house like the butler. The nurse was initially in collusion with Linda the homeowner, and Agatha left the guests, and Jean stayed to make sure no one left the mansion. He had a gun in his hand, having ensured that Linda and Agatha had left. The butler ordered everyone to go to the living room. Morris was lying on the floor, unconscious again in the living room. Jean explained to everyone that they must come up with a plausible scenario that the police will believe they must choose someone who will sacrifice themselves. It should appear as if the chosen person first took Charles's life, and then their own. The rest will receive their share. Josh started threatening the butler, but it didn't work. If anything happens to Jean, none of them will get the antidote. It's more than a 30-minute drive to the nearest hospital. Magdalene suggested there's another solution. Just take someone's life. Jean left, giving them time to ponder. The first candidate for the role of voluntary sacrifice was Aunt Clara. After all, she's the oldest here and has already lived long enough. However, Aunt Clara has something that makes her untouchable. According to the will, if her demise is not of natural causes, most of the money will be donated to the Rhinoceros Protection Fund Jean suggested. Result in the issue through a vote. Time is running out. So no one argued with that. Everyone voted by writing a name on a piece of paper. The majority voted for Luke. The guy tried to escape, but Josh, grabbing the gun, blocked his path. Everyone surrounded Luke, believing that he had pushed Charles down the stairs earlier to get his father's money. The fact that Luke recently lost almost all his wealth and the stock market only fueled suspicions. While everyone was arguing vehemently, Jean stepped away and opened the door to Agatha, who returned and asked if Charles was still in the dining room. Agatha was about to do what she must. Contrary to the order, 2 maids decided to return. They were driven by curiosity. G announced that there were 35 minutes left. Luke is still alive because there's an opinion that the demise of someone other than him among them will bring much more benefit to the rest. A fight broke out among the relatives, taking advantage of the commotion. Magdalene grabbed the gun, making everyone nervous. Magdalene wants to get rid of her husband, who has been deceiving the relatives for years for money. Magdalene hates the husband. His demise would solve many of her problems. During the argument, the relatives tried to denounce each other for various bad things. Each person in this room has their own dirty secrets. Meanwhile, the maids sneaked up to the living room door where voices could be heard through the crack. They saw Magdalene holding a gun to avoid being discovered. The maids fled and decided to hide in the dining room. Here they witnessed an even more horrifying sight. Lifeless, Charles was still at the table. The women realized they needed to leave here as soon as possible. It's evident that Mr. Bwitt and met his end at the hands of his relatives. The maids were planning to go to the police, but Agatha, with a gun, blocked their path. There are 27 minutes left and the poison will take effect. Jean played a recording of Charles and Linda's conversation. It was one of their last conversations. Charles said he suspected members of his family of playing unfairly. That's why Charles had been eavesdropping on all his relatives' phone calls recently. Each of them was plotting against him. There isn't a single person in this room who genuinely loved him. It remains unclear who is more deserving of being the sacrifice. There was a power outage which frightened everyone. When the lights came back on, G noticed that Melissa was missing. Everyone began searching for her throughout the house. Could Melissa have decided to hide to avoid becoming a sacrifice? Suddenly, sobs were heard from the bathroom. Melissa locked herself in, fearing that everyone would choose her because she is overweight. Additionally, Melissa and her husband Larry were involved in Josh's fraudulent schemes. Covering for him, Josh is the head of the finance department. According to Melissa, Larry risked everything for Josh because he secretly loves him. Larry denied his non-traditional orientation, but the argument was interrupted by Pet's attack on her husband Maurice. She suspected that there was something going on between him. And Kristen Aunt Clara announced that there was no affair. In fact, they are father and daughter. Kristen didn't want to believe it, but Maurice confirmed that he is indeed her father. Jean wrote down in his notebook and listed aloud the sins of each of those present. They had only 20 minutes left. Strange sounds came from one of the rooms. Then there was the sound of breaking glass, and the lights went out. Candles became the only source of light. Everyone slowly followed Jean, hearing how the frightening sounds grew louder. Josh held the gun ready. The electricity came back on the source of the sounds. Was the wind rushing in through the window, unable to handle the stress? Maurice fainted again. No one except Jean knows that Agatha is in the house, and she also has a gun with time running out. Jean decided to take matters into his own hands. There were only 10 minutes left before the poison took effect, and Jean suggested that fake decide Jean loaded only one bullet into the revolver. Now they must play Russian roulette. The drawing will decide who will be the first. Maurice was the lucky one, if you could call it that. It might be Maurice's last minute for the first time in his life. He gathered the courage to say everything he thought to his wife, however luck was on Maurice's side. And the gun didn't fire. Next was Aunt Clara. Without any hesitation, she pulled the trigger again, but the gun still didn't fire. Josh interrupted the game, unwilling to rely on chance. Josh decided that his wife would be the sacrifice and ordered everyone to go to the dining room. Everyone was surprised when they didn't see Charles in his place. Suddenly, loud laughter echoed from somewhere on the second floor. No one understood what was happening. In the hall, Jean turned on the TV. Charles, who was actually alive, was talking to them via video call. In reality, Charles and Linda didn't poison anyone. They devised this plan to expose their greedy relatives. Listening devices were installed throughout the house, providing more than enough evidence to send each of them to prison. Charles staged his demise. Influential friends helped him obtain a special medication that slowed his pulse. Now he plans to live out the rest of his life where no one will find him. The inheritance will go to no one. Charles believes that his entire family will learn this lesson forever. He did it for their own good, and Jean and Agatha assisted him and Linda. Police sirens blared. The game was over. Soon, Charles and Linda were enjoying life. He was with Agatha and the maids, and she was with Jean. The spouses talked on the phone, reveling in their shared victory. The only thing that remains unclear to this day is who pushed Charles down the stairs. That's the story where everyone who craved easy money got what they deserved, and only Aunt Clara, as always, was irresistible.
Hello.